With that kind of introduction, I feel like passing a plate or something. That'd be good. That'd be good. Linda and I are very blessed to come and be with you this morning. It's great to have an opportunity to visit Anna Street. In my mind, Anna Street is one of those churches that I've known about, oh my goodness, 50 years. And I hate to say that because that makes me feel old. Recently, Dr. Charles Stevenson was introduced in the Bible department as a legend, and he got up and the first thing he said was, you know what legend means? Old. That's kind of the way I feel a little bit. We have a lot of friends, church friends and connections that are in this church that go back, oh my goodness, 40 plus years, maybe more than that. And I want to say that I see this church as a church that has been active in missions, which is close to my heart, for years and years and years. I know from the very beginning when the Nami-Congo mission was started that this church had a part in that and has unfailingly continued to be supportive of, prayerful over, and even in going and visiting in missions for years and years and years. And I just think that that's a wonderful thing. I think churches make a mistake when they focus on themselves or do navel gazing and don't reach out somewhere else. In fact, I've heard Tom Langford talk about the fact that when we do missions, we're essentially tithing from our church for the greater kingdom. And I think that that's always a great thing. So this morning, I want to, by the title of our lesson up here, if we get it up here, do we really want a return of Perry Mason? That sounds like a strange name, but by the title of the page on this lesson, I'm sure you're confused about whether we're here for a Sunday morning worship service or an episode of Me TV. And if you know Me TV, you're laughing, then you probably watch it. I assure you it's a sermon, though I'm starting rather in an unusual place, and you'll see some scripture up here on this screen pretty soon. So just sit back for a moment and follow a trip down with me down memory lane. As a kid, I watched a lot of black and white television. I think I may have been a part of the first generation to grow up with a TV in their house. And we were entertained by the spectacle of entertainment performed very far away in like New York City or Los Angeles. And sure, the TV shows were mostly simple plot lines, sparse decorations, a lot more dialogue than action. After all, TV was learning how to distinguish itself from stage productions. And if you're old enough, you can look at that TV right there and know that that's the Lone Ranger on that television set. I used to really enjoy watching Perry Mason. He was a criminal defense lawyer working to clear defendants who seemingly were guilty, but were actually innocent. In fact, in the 9 years of TV shows from 1957 to 1966, Raymond Burr, who played Perry Mason, was the somber, serious, thoughtful defense lawyer who defended 271 cases on TV. And he won all of them but 3 on the cases. However, his assistant and potential love interest, Della Street, who was played by Barbara Hale, claimed in a 2009 program called All Things Considered on National Public Radio, she said that those 3 cases were actually declared mistrials off air. So, what can you say about that? A TV historian, Tim Brooks, wrote that Perry Mason was TV's most successful and longest-running lawyer series and has enjoyed rebroadcast fame for over 50 years, going to over 40 different countries and subtitles and winning numerous Emmys and other awards. Not surprisingly, but it is surprising to learn that Perry Mason was voted the most popular TV character on Netflix in 2014. That's surprising. Perry Mason's stories were basically the same. Someone's killed in the first few minutes of the show. The most likely suspect arrested by the police obviously has a motive or an opportunity. but doesn't seem guilty to Perry Mason. With the help from his assistant Della Street and Paul Drake, the detective who oftentimes ferreted out the important clues, Perry would close in on the truth. Small details overlooked by the prosecution and inconsistencies in eyewitness testimonies. And close to the end of the show, the key fact would be revealed in dramatic fashion. In most cases in the courtroom, the guilty party would be on the stand, would wither under the forceful gaze and determination of Perry Mason, who would verbally hammer the guilty person to the point of confession, usually eliciting gasps from the audience in the courtroom and also at home in the living room. In her confirmation hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee in July of 2009, Supreme Court nominee Sonia Sotomayor prefaced her remarks on the role of a prosecutor by saying that she was inspired as a child watching Perry Mason. What Perry Mason did was defend a person who by initial evidence was presumed guilty. However, Perry would dig deeper, uncover the real motives, gather the evidence to discover the real criminal for the case. Perry would weave together testimony, facts, receipts, phone calls, documents, eyewitness accounts to build an undeniable defense that would sway the jurists and often cause the prosecutor to drop the charges of Perry's now obviously innocent client. Perry Mason's modus operandi is how our judicial system works here in America. On legal principle, the court and jurists are to assume that the defendant is innocent until proven guilty. It's the job of the prosecutor to build a case strong enough with facts, with evidence, and with witnesses to prove the guilt of the defendant beyond a reasonable doubt. This gathering of evidence to prove guilt is the very foundation for many long-running crime TV shows of the 60s, such as Dragnet or The Avengers or Hawaii Five-0 or The Saint. There were also more humorous versions of catching criminals such as Batman and Magnum P.I., the very annoying Lieutenant Columbo, if you've ever watched him, or the frustratingly multiphobic Monk, and add to that more recent series like of Castle and Bones. Concerning the slightly more serious TV crime-fighting series, let's not forget Law and Order, the very popular CSI series that started in Las Vegas and then spread with lots of spin-offs. NCIS and its spin-offs, Sherlock and Blue Bloods. All of these work on the basic guilt-innocent principle of the legal system. Innocent until proven guilty. Until proven guilty. So the crime-fighting teams spring into action, build their case, and by now we are all very familiar with the really short music montages within the more modern shows where hours of investigative research display how evidence is painstakingly extracted out of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. And as a result of this building of evidence to prove guilt is not only the foundation of our legal system in America, but it has become a dominant form of entertainment. So it should not be surprising that the very same concept of evidence gathering, or opposition research has become a media and political tool of all parties. With the advent of digital media, that means that news programs and politicians now have access to the photos and video and comments made by their opponents from years ago. These files are meticulously researched to find a clip that displays the very opposite of what their opponent is saying, often absent without context. The media and the politicians will play the clip like wannabe Perry Masons in a kind of 30-second public trial to create the gotcha expose to demonstrate the hypocrisy or the flipping of principles by the opponent. The purpose is to prove to you, the audience, that the targeted person is guilty of some misdeed, a lie, or a character flaw. The evidence proves, they assert, that the person is unworthy by guilt for a political office or an ambassadorship or a judgeship or some organizational leadership, whatever. This gotcha culture has not limited itself to the political stage. Entertainers, celebrities, athletes, almost anyone in the public spotlight is vulnerable to the digital media search and accuse. The 30-second public trial culture that has sprung up in America. Americans have, without thinking, been caught up in this guilt-filled atmosphere of public, Perry Mason-like media trials. Americans cheer when their perceived opponent or bad guy is caught in the spotlight, and then they get angry and complain when their hero or the good guy becomes the target or the victim in the same hostile modern-day media trial. This media frenzy, where accusations and 30-second cases are piled up, is a perversion of the American legal system of innocent until proven guilty. It has become a game of provoking guilt or displaying a gotcha moment in order to dismiss the targeted person from all serious consideration. It is a media political beatdown to silence the alternative or dissonant voices, to remove the opportunity for any honest public debate on any issue of importance. In such an atmosphere, it is not justice that prevails, but only the loudest voices, the shrillest accusations, the strongest mobilization for a cause, and the cleverest 30-second trials. Now, what I describe is America, not Christianity. Let me speak about a time that I stumbled into a Christian trial example. I was living in Kitale several years ago, and I was on a team with Kirk and Susan Hayes and Mike and Carolyn Schrage and Dan and Tracy Harrod, and the church work was going really well. But as with all ministries, there were always problems to solve. In one church in particular called Nakalera, we were watching as a serious struggle began to rise up. Two men, both fairly equal in intelligence and charisma, struggled with each other to become the sole leader of a church. I hate to say it, but that happens in the church too, doesn't it? Emmanuel was the better public speaker, but Zechariah was the wealthier of the two. Each gathered around themselves some supporters who would help them gain the advantage over the other. As missionaries, we knew about the problem was there. We knew that it was there, but we prayed that somehow they would be able to solve this by themselves. The struggle lasted several months. We heard complaints from a lot of the members who did not want to choose a side. They begged us to come and address the problem. Now, during the struggle, both men developed cases as to why the other was unfit for leadership. They repeated their accusation to their followers, who took up their cause of their leader. Their rumors and backbiting was vicious. Each man spoke hurtful things about the other in an effort to gain the upper hand. And after months of struggle, it became clear that the church was equally divided. Neither man was going to win. And so they decided to handle the problem, not in a true Christian fashion, but in a traditional way with a Christian twist. Instead of going to the local chief, who would hear the complaints and decide for them with equal payment from both of them, they decided to call the missionaries for help. Come, they said, We want to explain our problem, and we want you to decide for us who will be the leader of Nakalira. Now, we knew what they wanted us to do. They wanted us to come to the church building, sit while both sides accused the other, and they told their own stories about why they were the better than the other one for leading the church, and they wanted to do this with the whole church present. A kind of Christian trial is what they were asking us to do. No doubt others were going to stand up and demand to be heard also, and we knew it was going to be the wrong spirit, and that such an event would take a painfully long time, and we were confident by experience that whatever decision was made would split that church and to cause one party to leave and stop worshiping there. We didn't want to go. We didn't want to sit like judges in a court and listen to evidence and eyewitnesses and information that was going to tear both of them down and apart. We were more interested in being peacemakers. You can imagine that none of us on our team wanted to volunteer to go to Nakalira. Well, we kind of drew straws, and Mike Schroggy and I got the short ones. So we set a day, and we drove down to Nakalira. And all the way down, Mike and I were in the car discussing how we could lead this meeting to a successful conclusion. How could we solve the problem without dividing the church? Was there any wisdom in how we could honor God in addressing the divisive issue that was going on? We were praying hard for guidance and some inspiration. As we neared the building, we hit on a radically odd, different, but Christian idea. One that we knew they were not going to be expecting us to give. And the more we talked about it, the more we were convinced it was the only way to lead the meeting. The question was, would they accept our spiritual direction and advice? Would they agree to our design for the meeting? We determined that we'd go in with this counsel, and if they refused, then we would not stay and do their way of doing it. It had to be our way or no way. We'd just leave. As we drove up to the church building, there was a massive crowd. Massive is the only word, more than could fit in the building. They were standing around outside, and on the near side, as we were driving up, Emmanuel stood there with 4 or 5 men all huddled around him together and leaning in, listening to Emmanuel give instructions. And he was pointing and doing this, arms waved. Emmanuel talked with passion. It was evident that his accusations and his defense was being carefully choreographed to the group. He will say this, and I'll say that, and don't forget to bring this up. Our hearts sank. Well, we drove past him and drove around to the other side of the building where we would park. And there we found Zechariah standing with his own group of men and a couple of women huddled around him. And he was less passionate in his gestures, but there was no doubt that he was developing his own case just as effectively. Whew. We got out of the car, and both men came up and almost fought to greet us first, as they both at the same time. Each one of them wanted to thank us for coming. Each one wanted to escort us into the building and to show us where we were supposed to sit. Inside, Mike and I were placed in 2 chairs at the very front of the building. The room filled up as fast as possible with men and women and children. They all found their spots on the wooden benches, and we realized that no one was going to introduce us or go through the normal formalities of a public meeting. All of this was different. We were to begin the meeting, or should I say trial. After a word, well, let me say this. As Mike and I had planned, we decided to spend about 30 minutes. We decided we'd spend 30 minutes singing and praying. 30 minutes just singing and praying. Mike began some songs, and the crowd responded enthusiastically, and they started singing, and they would, over there, you don't stand and sing, but, they start doing this kind of stuff, and the whole crowd was rocking. We had a large group of people, and we were really singing there. They seemed to genuinely embrace the songs and the prayers. Perhaps they were hungry for it. Afterward, it was my turn. So I stood up and I told them that we had heard about the problem at Nakalira. We were saddened that the problem had not been solved, and we believed the people of Nakalira were wise, that there were godly men and women there that sought to do God's will, and who should not have to use the government officials to make any kind of a case. At the same time, we told them that we didn't feel right to sit in a place of judgment or jury. So we came up with an alternative way to approach the problem. I told them that we would listen to any and all people who wanted to say something about the problem in the church. But we would not allow anyone to accuse or speak badly about another person. The only evidence that we wanted to hear was how that person themselves had contributed to the problem. We called on everyone to publicly confess their own sins in the division, not the sins of anyone else. I told them that I would act against culture, and I would stand up and shout down anybody who stood up to say anything bad about another person. And I asked for forgiveness in advance for behaving badly should I be forced to do so. We only wanted to hear confessions of personal wrong, nothing else. I looked over that crowd with the shocked faces, and I asked, "Do you understand our instructions?" And they silently nodded their heads. Yes, they did. With that, I sat down in my chair and I said, "Let's begin." It was probably the longest minute of silence in my life. Mike and I feared that this was going to go very badly, quickly. Then Emmanuel stood up, and with a somber look on his face, he said, "This is not what I expected you to do today, but I see the wisdom of what you want, and so let me try." At that, Emmanuel shocked us and everyone in there by confessing that for some time he had sought to become the sole leader of Nakalira Church. However, Zachariah also wanted to lead. And so Emmanuel confessed to being jealous of Zachariah and specifically listed ways in which he tried to undermine Zachariah. How he had spoken badly about him. In all, Emmanuel carefully laid out his wrong actions, his speech, and confessed before everyone that he had done wrong. He realized that he had not acted like a Christian, certainly not a mature one. He didn't want to fight anymore. He was sorry, and he turned right there in that group and looked at Zachariah and asked him and the church as a whole to forgive him. Mike and I were stunned. Emmanuel did everything we believed was most needed. In fact, he excelled at it. As soon as Emmanuel sat down, Zachariah stood up. In his less eloquent way, he too was touched by what was happening. With tears rolling down his face, he confessed to blocking Emmanuel. He had spoken bad words about him to other people in the audience. He had laid plans to chase Emmanuel from the church if he had succeeded. And they all realized that all of his plans were wrong. They were selfish. They were unchristian, and he too turned and looked at Emmanuel and then to the church and asked for forgiveness. As he sat down, one of the men huddled around Zacharias stood up and began his confession. And he talked about how he had chosen a side and worked to promote one man over the other. And he spoken bad things and planned how to become victorious in his struggle. And one by one, all the men in the two huddles stood up and confessed to various sins of speech or actions or attitudes. Mike and I were watching a cathartic moment as we could literally see the tension and the anger being released from the members in the room. And to our surprise, that meeting took a dramatic turn after about an hour in. Women started getting up and confessing their part in the struggle, but they also began to confess about struggling with their neighbors or with their husbands or with the children. And one woman sheepishly confessed, "I've been brewing beer this last week." Another woman confessed not honoring her husband and said she was going to try harder. I don't think the husband said amen or anything at the time. An older man stood up and confessed to drinking, having a problem with drinking. He spoke of his determination to stop, his declaration right there publicly to stop. At his confession, the crowd laughed out loud and started clapping for him. The confessions just gushed out of everybody. As anger subsided, there was this abundant, intense joy that filled the room. Smiles and laughter came easily, and every face was affected by it. We spent more than 3 hours going around the room. Everybody saying something. Everybody speaking. Mike and I stood up and joined in as well, confessing our struggles. When it was all done, we prayed, we thanked them, we closed the meeting with prayers spoken from very humble hearts. As we drove off, I remember looking out the window. Mike was driving, and I looked back just in time to see Emmanuel and Zachariah shake hands and then hesitate and then hug each other with a large crowd of men around them, all of them laughing. Within a year's time, both Emmanuel and Zachariah and a couple of other the men in that room, we ordained them as elders in that church. And they worked together in harmony for all the years that they did until Zechariah moved to another place and started another church very far away. And as far as I know, that church still meets at Nakalira. What Emmanuel and Zechariah did at Nakalira that day was physically demonstrate Matthew 7, verses 3 to 5, where it says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Instead of the Perry Mason approach, where we gathered the overwhelming evidence of guilt in Nakalira, we encouraged a Matthew 7 approach. We implored both men to stand up, confess the planks in their own eyes, to remove them first, so that they could see and help their brother remove the speck of sawdust out of their own eyes. And of course, with both men removing the planks, both could see clearly how they had each failed to be true Christian leaders for the church at Nakalira. Instead of a courtroom scene where the guilty are exposed, and someone is punished, at Nakalira experienced a congregational release of tension, followed by a euphoric sense of celebration. And instead of choosing sides, they were unified. And instead of one side losing, both sides won. And all of the people rejoiced. I hear a lot about justice today. It fills the news cycles, the media platforms, the speeches of the political leaders and the famous. And it has become the subject of many books and sermons. And there are many passages that talk about seeking justice. For example, do not deprive or deny the foreigner, the orphaned, the poor, or the widow of justice. Again, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow, and speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. This pursuit of justice is good because we know the Lord loves justice. But we must be careful in our rush to pursue and mete out justice for fear of falling under the condemnation of the prophet Amos, who condemned the prideful boasting of the Israelites, saying, "You have turned justice into poison, and the fruit of righteousness into bitterness." Or the very clear admonition in Leviticus 19, "Do not pervert justice." So in the midst of this current social furor to pursue justice, we as Christians must ask ourselves, how could we pervert or poison justice? Well, we could call evil good and good evil in Isaiah 5. Or we might seek to administer justice without a trace of compassion or mercy. Listen to what the prophet Zechariah says is included in true justice. This is what the Lord Almighty said: "Administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another." This begs the question, can justice be true if mercy and compassion are absent? I believe the answer is no. Jesus condemned the Pharisees in Matthew 23, saying, "Woe to you, teachers of the law, and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. You have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." I wanted to stop for a moment and have you notice the dash between law and justice there. Grammatically, it is called an M dash, an elongated a dash that's different from a hyphen. It's used to indicate a range or to connect adjectives together, like green-eyed woman, or in the case of a range like 20 to 30. In this case, an M dash is used to emphasize the previous word, law, with the following descriptive phrases that has commas within it. The purpose is to emphasize that the law by expanding on its description. Jesus includes three elements in the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Consider how these three elements of the law are paralleled in Micah 6:8, perhaps one of the most important passages in the Old Testament. He says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." So how should we respond to this current culture of pursuing justice in America? Yes, we seek, pursue, provide, do not deny, and do justice, and do this for the poor, the weak, the voiceless, the immigrant, the widow, the orphan, the homeless, the disenfranchised, so much as it is within your power, do justice equally to all others. But when they do not show justice to you, and when they treat you unfairly or take advantage of you, show mercy. You must not focus so passionately upon the wrongs of others that you forget that you have a plank in your own eye. Do not forget that you are, in some way or another, also part of the problem. That God demands you to overcome your own blindness and correct your own mistakes and failures first, remembering that your own predicament and standing before God will enable you to forgive others the mistakes they have and their injustices toward you. Be careful also in sitting at home and dispensing out your version of justice upon the actions of others without truly knowing the circumstances. Do not succumb to the 30-second media trials presented on TV every hour of the day. Be smarter than that. Dig deeper. See things and understand things through godly eyes. And let spiritual principles guide you and not our American culture before opening your mouth or standing up to do something. And do both of these, justice and mercy, in humility, realizing that the God of true justice is watching over everything that we do, that we say, and that we think, and that we believe. This is what is required of us according to Micah 6:8. So run out there into our social, messy setting and pursue justice. But distinguish yourselves as Christians by extending mercy in all humility. So here's my challenge to you. Seek a path of action that unifies instead of divides, that lifts up rather than tears down, that opens up channels of communication rather than shutting them down, that encourages collaboration over forceful acquiescence, that brings out the best in others, not their worst, that promotes peace over strife and harmony over division, and that instills Christ's love, not human hatred. Follow these challenges, and you will truly distinguish yourself from those who believe without understanding, who act without truth, who speak without mercy, and divide without love. Be careful not to get swept away in today's politically charged atmosphere. I beg you, I encourage you to stay rooted in Christ. And remember, not to willing become the judge and the jury in a 30-second Perry Mason gotcha trial. Be wiser. Be smarter. Resist. And may the Lord bless us all with the ability to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before Him. Let's pray.